Good afternoon and welcome to the Policy Exchange for this, the second of 3 sessions on industrial policy. My name is Richard Davis. I write about the British economy for The Economist, and I'm joined today by 4 excellent speakers. On the far left we have Lord Heseltine, who's an MP between 1966 and 2001 and held various ministerial posts, including Deputy Prime Minister. We just had a quick cup of coffee, and Lord Heseltine told me that he has form in this area, having worked on industrial issues since at least 1972, and first clearly calling for an industrial policy in his 1987 book, Where There's a Will. Last year he published an independent review which set out around 89 proposals for how Britain can set up a policy. So he is packed with experience and ideas. Next up, we have Gordon Marsden MP, who's MP for Blackpool South. He's a history specialist before he became an MP, and now sits on the shadow BIS front bench. To his right is David Skelton, who's the Acting Director of the Policy Exchange and has written about public policy, public sector reform for various publications. And on the far right, we have Dave Smith, done that the wrong way around. Dave Smith is next to Lord Heseltine. He is Chief Executive of Sunderland City Council and has spent his life as a civil servant working across the public sector in social housing, social care and economic regeneration. And this is Gordon Marsden MP. Sorry about that. We have a range of interesting questions to get through today, which I think people should have in the brief. Many of them are focused on essentially regionalism. And I'm going to ask the speakers to make their introductory remarks, but if they can, to try and link those to the kind of wider macroeconomic malaise that Britain is in at the moment. This morning's Bank of England inflation report showed very limited growth over the next 2 or 3 years. I think in real terms we will be back to the 2008 peak, maybe in 2016, 2017. So we're well on the way to a lost decade. We've slipped from 5th in terms of goods exports in 2001 to 11th in terms of goods exports last year. So in answering these questions about regionalism and industrial policy, I'd be very interested if you think that it has the capacity, when knitted together, to solve some of the big macroeconomic problems. So first up, Lord Heseltine, please.
Well, thank you, and it is a privilege to be able to address so distinguished and wide-based an audience. I have 7 minutes in order to solve the entire problems of Britain's industrial economy, and I will gallop, therefore, over headlines. I don't believe there are short-term, easy solutions to the long-term issues facing this country. To coin a phrase, there is no money left, and no government is going to change that situation. So we have to work our way out, and that means change. Change is wonderful for you, because you all do need to change. Of course, I don't need to change, because I'm already doing whatever I do as well as it can conceivably be done. And that, of course, that simple statement confronts the real issue, because most of the solutions that are produced as the immediate challenge for the country are solutions that people can nod to and assent because they don't actually ask them to change what they're doing very substantially. My view is we do need to change. We need to change the way we approach the government of this country. And I have had the privilege of being invited to put forward proposals as to what I mean by that. I personally think that the courage of the government in enabling me to have a free hand in doing that is unique and without precedent. I do not know of anybody who has ever been given a civil servant from each government department and a free hand to write whatever report I felt appropriate. No minister saw a word of the text before it went to the printers, and not a word of the text was changed as a result of any pressure from outside. Going at a very great pace, I think we are over-centralized. I think that for very obvious democratic reasons, the wealth-creating instincts that made Britain's great cities have been replaced by a social provision that meets the democratic preoccupation with the urban problems that developed as a result of the industrial wealth accumulation of the 18th and 19th centuries. And that process of centralism required a massive reallocation of taxes from those who created the wealth in the first place to those who actually manage the social provision, which is now the essence of the local authority world, which has replaced the entrepreneurial world of the 18th and 19th centuries. So you have a different sort of person doing a different sort of thing, which is different to the wealth-creating motives that made this country in the first place. Democracy demanded it. My own personal instincts is that it was essential because the conditions were appalling. But it is important to understand how it all came about. The process now means that a huge proportion of the money that is available to pursue an industrial policy is administered in London by officials working for functional departments. This is unlike any other capitalist economy, or indeed any other economy which I have any knowledge in the international world. All of them are based on competing local economies with a great deal of initiative within the component parts to back their own strengths and to pursue what they believe to be the opportunities that those strengths provide. We prescribe centrally and functionally. And the atmosphere outside London is one of waiting to be told what they can have and what they can do with it. I don't believe that is an entrepreneurial attitude, and I don't believe it is the attitude that created this country in the first place. So my solution, part solution, because there are millions of components to any solution, but the first thing that I hope the government will do is to try to recreate something of a balance between the economic engines of this country, as measured today by the local enterprise partnerships. You could design other ones. Redcliffe did in the 60s, but the one that is today on offer is the local enterprise partnership. It commands a very significant degree of local support and a very considerable degree of cross-party support, and therefore let us choose what is there without turning the whole thing upside down and starting again. So how do you get more choice into the hands of those people who comprise the local enterprise partnerships? I did an investigation into how much money there was in the distribution process from central to local expenditure. And it's not a difficult exercise. You simply calculate how much is going to the housing, how much to the roads, how much to the environment, how much to schools, how much to this, that, and the other. And we came up with a figure. Actually, I have to tell you, the figure we came up with was wrong. When I first heard that, I thought, oh, my Lord, that's the headline, disastrous overstatement. The truth is, it's too low. And there's more money than I first thought, by something like £12 billion, because we'd taken an annual figure as a 4-year figure. So there was 3 times as much in the local authority capital figure, which puts another 12 billion into the pot. But it doesn't matter precisely the size of the pot. The important thing is it's one very large sum of money, something between 70 and 80 billion pounds over the review period. That is distributed functionally. My proposal is that it should be made a competitive process. And the competitive process has many advantages. First of all, it enables local communities to look at their strengths and see where they think the priorities are, what the money should be spent on, as opposed to listening to what a functional department thinks it should be spent on. And that draws the community into a competitive process, but into another process as well, because as a condition of that, you can ask them to say, if you get a part of this, what will you add? I've had a lot of experience of adding private sector and outside contributions to public money, starting with the urban grant of 1979, the development corporations, City Challenge, the Regional Growth Fund. Generalizing, you can see a pattern where one raised sometimes 3, 4, 5 times more money outside the money of the government, the central government, because local processes delivered private sector investment, sovereign fund investment, pension fund investment, third sector investment, whatever it may be, you get this gearing. So you get local strengths reinforced, you get gearing. And so when I say at the beginning there is no money left, there's no public money left, but there is a very significant amount of potential money from outside. And that could be a major stimulant to the economic fortunes of our economy. The present situation is that the government have accepted the principle of doing that. And within a matter of weeks now, they will flesh out what they mean by that. I cannot know what the scale will be or the breadth will be. But all the indications are that the idea has attracted attention within government and will be the basis of future policies. This is not absolutism. This is not handing the money over to local enterprise partnerships and telling them to get on with it and say how it all worked. Central governments are elected. They have manifestos. They have priorities. So there has to be a policy document inviting the bids, setting out what the government priorities are. Those policy documents could change, one government with another. They could include some things and exclude others. The wider they are, the more money you can include, and the more ambitious you can be. You can, for example, include educational standards as something you want the bidding to reflect. You can include the skills agenda and the way in which it reflects into the local economy. You could include things like bad housing conditions, which have a massive interrelationship with all sorts of economic problems in the areas concerned. Or you could simply concentrate the whole thing on economic generation and define it tightly. So you have a very wide range of options in the policy document that can suit a different government, one government or another. And you have the capacity then to share the decisions centrally and locally. As I say, it's not absolutism. You therefore need a machinery in order to enable you to do that. And there are those who say, well, that's more bureaucracy. That it must have a truth in it. But the existing bureaucracies, of course, could be smaller, or more dispersed, or more locally based, doing a different thing, reflecting local strengths and weaknesses as opposed to reflecting ministerial views. So you have, yes, adjustments. And that, the mechanisms I'm now working on in Birmingham and in Humberside, to look as to how this process, if it were to be adopted, would work on the ground. And we will look at things like organograms as to how the present bureaucracy actually works and the effect that it has on local initiative. But there's no limit to the agenda that can be pursued in the pursuit of growth. And I happen to believe that what we have to do in this country is to raise the game. I mentioned by starting about the need for change. We need a lot of change. And a way to get change is to set standards and ask people to comply with or show how they are augmenting or achieving those standards in a competitive environment. And that's been my experience in City Challenge and things like that, which had a really galvanizing effect on dealing with urban squalor. But it's entirely up to government to define where they want the effort to come. But then you're left with, and this is to me very exciting, a very simple thought. When I travel the country talking to local enterprise partnerships, I find myself in a room with perhaps 20 people. There will be 3 or 4 leaders of local authorities and or their chief executives, big players in any community. There will be several people who run significant-sized companies, some exporting companies, some service industries, whatever they may be. There will be the vice-chancellor of 1, 2 universities. There will be people of that equivalence from different structures of the local economy. Maybe the boss of the local health service, whatever it may be. They are the ones who would be in a position ultimately to formulate the bid for money. Working on a place-based assumption, looking at things from the ground up, building on strengths, fighting known weaknesses. The alternative is a group of 15 officials who are specialists in a given field, sitting in London, making recommendations to ministers as to what they think fits the pattern of the whole country. I happen to be one of the great admirers of British civil servants, but I don't believe that that process, functionally organized, without concept of place, is as sophisticated or as relevant as what I find in the local enterprise partnerships up and down the country. So mine is a historic concept, it is a comprehensive concept, and it is transferring power back to the place where the economy is actually determined. I wait to see what happens, but I think change is in the air. And if there is one thing that has come out of this appalling recession, which is worldwide and beyond the control of governments, much to influence, it is there is now a willingness to look at the detail of how we perform in this country and to seek out to try and engage far more people on a much more diverse basis in solving our problems, rather than thinking it can all be done by governments or Whitehall.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. Can I just start by saying it's a great pleasure and a great honour to follow Michael Heseltine, Lord Heseltine. I was interested in what you said, Lord Heseltine, about the organogram of how things work. I do have to warn you that when I served on the Select Committee for Business and Skills, and we were looking at funding in further education and how that was devolved and used, we asked the civil servants to produce an organogram so it would illustrate the funding process. They spent about 4 months and produced 6 sides of A4, and the then chair of the Select Committee rather mischievously put the most complicated one on the cover of the report. I hope you have more success in getting the organogram than the Select Committee did. But seriously, as I say, it is a great pleasure and honour to follow Michael Heseltine, not least because we're talking about job creation here today, or touching on it, and in an indirect way, he aided me in job creation in the 1980s, because one of the things that Michael did among his many achievements was to create the organisation which works and is now known very successfully as English Heritage. And as you've heard, I was a history specialist, and in that process, outside agencies rather than the civil servants, as Michael will remember, were asked to promote and to launch English Heritage, and I had the privilege of assisting in that operation and then being English Heritage's public affairs advisor for 2 years. So, as I say, I won't say I owe it all to you, but I'm very grateful. However, To return to the subject, I mean, a shadow minister with responsibility since 2010 for regional growth, and obviously as a member of Parliament representing a constituency in the northwest of England, I'm going to be, and I have in fact always long argued for the importance of government having a growth policy across the regions and not just London and the southeast. And without going too much over previous history, I think whatever view you have or had of the regional development agencies, the process and the speed with which they were abolished was handled really pretty poorly. And the local enterprise partnerships have, for the most part of their first 2 years, been severely hampered and hamstrung by a lack of resources and capacity, which is one of the things that Michael Heseltine's alluded to. The haste with which the government proceeded with their abolition plans meant that a number of good, experienced staff from the RDAs were lost as the LEPs weren't able or ready to take them on. And the fact that all this took place in the most challenging economic climate for a generation for England's regions did us no favour. The fact also is, despite the rhetoric of government and the continuing rhetoric of government, their abolition saw many of their powers and their initiatives ceded back to Whitehall. The control over former RDA assets and the money received from their sales, one of the most controversial, inward investment powers back with UKTI, with a mixed track record up until now of attracting investment outside London and the southeast. And even the Regional Growth Fund, despite its name, still remains a fund largely administered and run via civil servants in Whitehall, with an excellent task force of luminaries, but with little recourse for regional input or sifting into that process. Michael Heseltine has talked about dispersing existing bureaucracies. You've just heard him say that, and he said that he has a regard for civil servants. He's probably not, therefore, going to adopt the principles of the Cultural Revolution, which I was once told meant that they shot a third, promoted a third, and sent a third out into the fields. Before anybody jots anything down, I'm not proposing that for the civil service, except the last one, because that is actually touches very much on what Michael Heseltine has said, the ability to get people out of Whitehall and second them for a short period of time, a year, 18 months, long enough to understand but not so long as to go native, I do actually think would be a really important part of that process. So through the central administration, we've seen a number of issues plaguing the RGF. The delays that have slowed down the delivery of cash into England's regions, the transparency, the value for money, which was highlighted in the NAO report, and the fact the government earlier this week has launched exceptional RGF, to deal with the £100 million which come back from bidders and is still floating around, sort of highlights the problems. And that's why back in 2011, I and the then Shadow Business Secretary, John Denham, put forward 6 points to strengthen the LEPs, to give them greater resources, influence and power. We proposed modest capacity funding to help them in their formation, as well as no immediate fire sale of RDA assets and the ability for LEPs to set some local skills strategies, precisely for the sort of kick-starting process that Michael Heseltine has alluded to. And to be fair, belatedly, the government, at least in part, has adopted a number of those suggestions. The major development before Lord Heseltine's report came from Greg Clark when he was at CLG, and I pay tribute to him for recognising that the LEPs in their initial forms were not ideally suited to driving forward the rebalancing that we all need. And so, of course, he put forward the city deals with powers that now are in excess of LEPs and potential to access new funding streams such as tax incremental financing and devolved skills arrangements and apprenticeship hubs. I have no doubt that the prospect of increased devolved power and resources will help those initial city deals kick on with their growth plans. And it follows the pattern that the LEPs that have been most successful to date, such as in Greater Manchester, have drawn on the fact that there is already significant power at the local level via the group of metropolitan authorities, the 10 local authorities working together. So we in the Labour Party welcome the prospect of the city deals and the powers that it confers on cities. But we have to remember that when it comes to rebalancing the economy, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that there are plenty of areas currently outside of those city deals that will not benefit from additional powers, resourcing and funding. And I and others have long warned that this risks the development of a two-speed regional growth landscape, with city deals motoring on and those without being left in the slow lane. And that's not going to do a great deal to address the disparities within regions, let alone disparities between regions. I would agree with Lord Heseltine's comments to the Select Committee yesterday that the government lacks a place-based strategy. This was, again, another initiative that John Denham worked on in the run-up to the 2010 election in the form of Total Place. And it was one of the things that was strongly linked to the powers for the Manchester and Leeds city regions that were announced in March 2010, and incidentally helped to lay the groundwork for the subsequent city deals. But we do need a holistic growth strategy that takes on board not just urban areas, but the suburban, the second-tier towns and cities, as well as seaside, coastal towns and rural areas. Now, I may be speaking party pre as an MP for a coastal constituency, but we simply cannot neglect areas such as this, especially as many are adversely affected by the long-term trends of tourism moving away from the UK, which incidentally includes a number of seaside and coastal towns in the otherwise prosperous greater southeast areas. So we welcome the publication of No Stones Unturned. It continues the debate, which has been placed at the forefront of our agenda, for adopting an active industrial strategy. And of course, we have to remember that the ground for that was laid by the strategy New Industry, New Jobs that Lord Mandelson promoted during his time at BIS. And the Technology Strategy Board, the Office for Life Sciences, the Automotive Council, all these are things that have been carried on and taken forward. So we're looking forward to the government's formal response to Lord Heseltine's report. I think the importance of which makes it quite clear that we can't create conditions for regional growth without a proper link-up of policies with skills policies. Having more decisions about skills policies taken locally can only be a good thing. It helps encourage the better engagement with businesses, schools, colleges and the LEPs. One of the positive things that the RDAs did do was to foster an informal architecture that brought together these key players and allowed engagements to take place. That is going to be key. That's why we welcomed the agenda that Doug Richard put forward, his apprenticeship report last year, and why we have launched our One Nation Skills Task Force on the back of Ed Miliband's conference speech about raising the status of vocational learning and taking the agenda forward with key industry figures. But as I've been going around LEPs over the last 2 years, I've seen instances of where this is working well. I've seen other areas such as Greater Cambridge and Peterborough, strong ties with the university and the FE sector, exactly the point that Lord Heseltine made. The Thames Valley LEP, high businesses like Oracle and Microsoft being very involved. But this is still very patchy, and there is still a large number of LEPs which are operating on a very much more traditional local authority front. The crucial thing for all LEPs and for all of these initiatives is that they remain business-facing in their outlook. If they become subsumed with local council or local county council agendas, however admirable they may be, they will not hit the bullet points that we need to hit. The strategy we need for growth for the future needs to be a combination of a regional strategy, but a sectoral one too. And we've seen successful blueprints for this in the North East and in the West Midlands with the automotive industry. And you can begin to see how that might operate regionally again with the aerospace industry in both the Southwest and the Northwest, alongside major employers such as Airbus and BAE Systems. The reality is that whoever is in government in 2015 will inherit a very fractured, complex landscape of responsibilities and structures for growth, for skills, for apprenticeships, and that will have to be accommodated for whatever the government's response to Lord Heseltine's thoughtful and excellent report. So while, of course, I think devolving power, responsibility and funding is a key driver in creating the conditions for regional growth, I think there's more to it than that. It will be about allowing organic, bottom-up structures to evolve around sectoral interests and travel to work areas, forums that bring together key stakeholders in local business, education and local authorities to work together on determining the area's local priorities. But in order to do that and create the growth, the step changes in growth that we need, it has to be done in the context of active, intelligent government, shaping but not micromanaging those markets. And that, I'm afraid, despite all their warm words and despite the almost universal approval with which Lord Heseltine's report has been received, is an area where this government remains still at best schizophrenic and in too many cases still not meeting the objectives and the vision that Michael Heseltine has laid out.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this debate. I don't think it'll come to a surprise as anyone in this audience that from a regional perspective, being a regional player, I fully support the approach around regional economic policy. However, there's a world of difference between an economic policy for a region and an economic policy by a region. Our history is littered with the former. I believe at the heart and centre of Lord Heseltine's review is an attempt to reach the latter. And I want to contribute to the debate by giving some of the experiences at the receiving end of the difference between policy and its implementation that so frustrates attempts to grow within the context of a regional economy. And to that end, I want to make 4, I hope, fairly simple points to you as a means of provoking the debate. My first point really is that detail matters. Seeing beyond, for example, the 8% decline in the growth in the North East economy over the last few years, to understanding the intrinsic rather than comparative structural strengths and weaknesses in the regional economy and how they interact is absolutely imperative to finding the right solutions and the right implementation of those solutions. This debate should not be about a comparison with London and the South East, but it should be about a deeper and keener understanding of the indigenous regional economy and the opportunities for growth within those economies. Too much of our UK economic studies and associated policies apply a set of economic criteria built around measures of success in a relatively narrow band of sectors and geographies. To set things in perspective, say for the North East, the Nissan car plant, which has been made reference to, which is based in Sunderland and employs itself 6,000 people across the region, is already the UK's largest car plant. It exports 80% of its product, and in a couple of years' time will be producing half of the entire national output of the UK in this field. The supply chain itself is double the size of Nissan and based in the region, and that in itself is only 30% of the supply chain. It produces 1.2 million cars a year now, and Nissan is heading for 6,000 it's producing a value of 1.2 million cars, and is heading for 6,000 cars a year. However, despite all that wealth generation, any region that has as its basis industry, whether it's in the automotive sector or in other forms of process and advanced manufacturing, the clear and material story is that much of that growth does not trickle down to the wider economy. So much of those urban areas remain relatively poor in comparison with the wealth creation that happens within the manufacturing sector. The answer to those challenges rests in understanding the economic narrative within those regions, not on a national single policy. My second point is that appetite matters as much as intellect. Solving the economic challenges in the North East requires a sense of focus, material appetite, as well as intellectual rigour. Nowhere has a greater ambition for itself than those who are interacting in that region, as I think Lord Heseltine said earlier. Simply, if you live it and breathe it, then your desire to address it is that much keener. Mediating and filtering options through the wrong economic lens is debilitating and leads to the wrong choices. Such spatially blind or one-size-fits-all approaches lack sensitivity to place and to context. Worse still, they risk not being able to realise the potential for growth across the more challenging towns and cities of the UK, where the appetite to grow and undertake innovative approaches to succeed is often the greatest. Structures in themselves, including governance structures, do not guarantee the devolution of power and responsibility. Indeed, many of the examples we could cite over the past period of time in terms of attempts to regionalise policy have all been about for the region, not by the region. Until we break that link and find a new way forward, then simply devolving the material resources will not lead to the change. And in that sense, I make my third point, which is devolution must be meaningful, truly meaningful. Regional policies have not had the anticipated impact in rebalancing the economy over history, not because of the regional economic weaknesses, but because of the central inertia to really adopting the policy. The policy has been set out by Lord Heseltine. For me, from my perspective and my experience, is unquestionably the direction we ought to go in. But perfect policy is still reliant on perfect implementation. And however benign the forces are in attempting to pursue the policy, if it's not really being pursued as a means of ensuring that regions can seek their own solutions, then the policy is immediately flawed. True regional policy has to devolve not only the supporting resources and powers, but also must devolve mobilisation, prioritisation, decision-making and action. Let's take an example, current example, in terms of the much applauded DFT's devolution of regional spend on local major transport schemes. Of course, the devolution of resources, from my perspective, is to be welcomed. But is it really devolution when it comes with a DFT's rule book on acceptable cost-benefit ratios, a perception of what congestion means, and a set of prioritised criteria by which those resources apparently devolved can be spent? Suddenly, the opportunity to innovate and create and address our transport challenges in the North East are being mediated by a set of policies and criteria and priorities, presumably largely based on the experience of transport challenges in London and the South East. It simply does not make sense when you're sat in the North East. Fourthly and lastly, I absolutely recognise the accountability that local arrangements through local authorities and our business partners have to government. It is essential to have that accountability, as it is essential to have that competitive edge. But it has to be an accountability on outcomes, not on inputs. Commitments to growth, however they're measured, and accountability on the delivery is what the true relationship should be between a region and central government. I wish to be judged about whether we deliver on our commitments in economic growth, not be judged on whether we have a set of inputs determined centrally and to be delivered locally. Those outcomes need to be agreed at both the regional and as well as the central level, and they have to be understood, as Lord Heseltine has said, within national priorities and national context. I think it's interesting to view at the moment, as has already been referred to, the current performance of UKTI, and consider the fact that UKTI does not have anything other than national targets for inward investment is a good case in point. Clearly, if you work for an institution that's being judged on that sort of national criteria, then it's quite natural, normal and appropriate that you will seek the markets that have the most opportunity to deliver your targets first. The North East does not present that same opportunity. I would conclude by saying that I think that we are at an important stage in designing the future of regional policy, and both local government and local enterprise has a huge job to play in this. In the North East case, that's a challenge we are desperate to take up. There is no resistance to a regionalised approach in the North East. The more we're able to really believe in both devolved resources and devolved power and decision making, the more that we believe that we can influence our contribution to the economic prosperity of the whole of the UK. But it has to come on those terms, mediated in an agreement with government. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We're delighted to be holding this event here at Policy Exchange today with such a distinguished panel. As Richard already mentioned, as part of an industrial policy series, which is very important to us. And this is a really crucial issue that we're discussing today. Politicians of all parties have talked about the importance of rebalancing in the economy, having a strong London in the South East, but making sure that as a country we aren't over-dependent on one sector, and that one part of the economy doesn't contribute a disproportionate amount of jobs and growth. And it's pretty clear that still isn't the case at the moment. There are many thriving cities outside of the South East. Some of the fastest growing cities over the past decade, 2 decades, have been in the north, with Newcastle, Preston, Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool and Sunderland all being good examples. And what Sunderland has done to make the city a high-tech manufacturing leader is a great example of what can be done. There's also been some good news over the past few days. The Financial Times on Monday reported that jobs growth in the North East, in Yorkshire and the West Midlands had outstripped the national rate of job growth since last summer. And it's also worth mentioning the North East is the only region which is a net exporter, exports more than it imports. So there is some positive news, but it's clear the north-south divide still remains, and there is some evidence it might be getting wider. Consider the state of the economy before the crash and the state of the economy now. The economy in London and the South East is actually larger than it was before 2008. As Dave mentioned, the economy of the North East is 8% smaller than it was before the crash. Unemployment is 6.5% in the South East, excluding London, and it's 9.5% in the North East. There's also a considerable and a notable skills gap. 38% of Londoners have a degree, qualification or better. 30% of people in the South East have a degree, qualification or better. And that figure's only 22% in the North East. So those figures illustrate the extent in many areas of that north-south divide. And there's still plenty of towns outside of the South East that are continuing to struggle from the after effects of deindustrialisation. I'm thinking of my hometown of Consett, which had a steelworks, when it closed down, had for a time the highest rate of unemployment in Western Europe, but is still struggling with a high rate of unemployment, still struggling with worklessness and skills problems. And it does show that these problems aren't solved quickly or easily and need radical and intelligent solutions to solve them, many of which I thought were contained in Lord Heseltine's report. But despite the well-intentioned efforts of many governments, this divide has remained stubbornly large for decades. And as the skills figures make quite clear, there still seems to be a brain drain from north to south, with many talented northerners seeking to make a living in London and in the South East. The gap between the regions is bigger than in any other European country, and it's clear that they have to be imaginative when considering solutions to these issues. But I think we need to remember that London is strong because of its size and its dynamism, meaning that cities in the north and in the Midlands have to be allowed to expand and to grow in order to compete. The key for the regions is the creation of sustainable private sector jobs. In areas of residual high unemployment, the creation of public sector jobs was an understandable way of cutting unemployment over the past couple of decades. But the problem is that, in many cases, that wasn't sustainable. If there is an excessive dependence on public sector jobs, then those towns and cities will always be at the front of the queue when a government needs to cut expenditure, as true in the late 1970s as in the present round of austerity. And it's worth pointing out that even after a big increase in public sector jobs, multiple regeneration programmes and plenty of public money being spent, the gap between North and South still remains stubbornly wide. The North East still has lower GVA per head, higher unemployment and more worklessness than anywhere else in the country. And I think the policymakers do have to remember the importance of cities when they're considering this issue. Ed Glazer's excellent book, The Triumph of the City, has made clear that in a global knowledge-based economy, vibrant cities are absolutely essential to achieving growth. And for me, that means that northern cities have to be allowed to expand. At the moment, many cities are being held back, which in turn is holding back the economy outside of London. Because of restrictive planning laws, meaning our cities have had to become denser rather than expanding outwards, northern cities can be very expensive places to do business in. Office space in Manchester is more expensive than office space in Manhattan. Office space in Newcastle is more expensive than office space in Oxford and Cambridge. And that obviously isn't very good if those cities want to expand economically. An example of Preston shows what can be done when outdated planning restrictions are lifted and northern cities are allowed to expand. Preston enjoyed the third highest rate of private sector job creation between 1998 and 2008. And that wasn't accidental. The reason lies in planning policy. Preston was supposed to be part of the Central Lancashire New Town, a project which was started but then abandoned. However, this left a positive legacy, meaning that business could use a network of roads and sites around the edge of the city, and land was available with planning permission already granted. For me, this is quite crucial. It meant that business could locate where business thought was the right place for them, and with minimal bureaucracy around planning restrictions, rather than where local authorities or bureaucrats thought was the right place for them to be. Getting a few things right, in this case, transport, planning and land availability, enabled the success of Preston. And I think getting those things right will help the expansion and the growth in other northern and Midlands towns and cities. Particularly given the resistance to expanding cities in parts of the south, cities and towns in the North and Midlands can get an advantage if they are prepared to expand, encouraging professionals who want green space rather than living in increasingly cluttered city centres in the south. So planning policy is crucial to regional growth, but there are also other things that government can and should be doing. It's important that government sets out a compelling vision for regional growth and puts in place the infrastructure to make this happen. Local economic partnerships need the tools and the power to ensure that they can play a real role as hubs and enablers between businesses, universities and other institutions. And government should also ensure that the right digital and transport infrastructure is in place to allow businesses to flourish. Transport spending per head is still massively skewed towards London and the South East, as parts of the North continue to suffer from poor train connections and often appalling road networks. I mean, if anyone has tried driving through Northumberland where certain roads still aren't dualled, that's a great example of where transport infrastructure is absolutely necessary and isn't there at the moment. If we want to base regional growth on our northern and Midland cities, we have to make sure they're well connected to other towns, other parts of the region and other parts of the country. We also have to ensure that our regions have the right skills in place to make sure they make the most of their comparative advantages. That does mean a focus on academic rigour, but also means a proper vocational and technical track, with employer engagement in course design and quality assurance, and a proper academic core, which would provide some of the skills that our regions and our employers badly need, particularly in areas such as high-tech manufacturing. The gap between our regions has been widening for decades, and it's pretty clear there is no easy, quick fix to the problem. But there is an immense potential in our regional economy, and regional growth is absolutely crucial to our future prosperity as a nation. With radical reforms, a real vision and the right infrastructure, our regions can flourish once again.
I'd now like to open up for questions. Some really interesting points there. I think everybody's quite clear that they see huge potential in a new kind of regional approach. Something that I thought was quite interesting was this a kind of subtle difference between the various speakers over whether we need a kind of active approach where we sort of set up competition between the regions, or whether it's more about kind of pulling out, cutting red tape, a passive approach, government doing less, in fact. So that was a kind of key theme that I drew up. But I'll open it up to questions now, if people could say where they're from. All right.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Thank you. John Young from MPW Sixth Form College, and my question is really on the significance of the high-speed rail link. Is this the way in which the regions are going to be stimulated, or could it paradoxically suck energy still further into the southeast? High-speed rail.
Anyone? Lord Heseltine?
I'd go for it. Linking the north and other areas, Scotland, into the European economy is absolutely a no-brainer. And there's also a need to build new capacity anyway, so you might as well do it well.
Thank you. Tracy Davenport from KPMG. Just to pick up sort of on one of the points that Dave Smith had mentioned and open it up a little bit further. You had mentioned that sort of governance and delivery structures of LEPs don't necessarily equate to success. But then if we look at some of the examples that were given, such as the Leeds City region and also AGMA or Greater Manchester, you're seeing those existing sort of core delivery structures and maybe the way that they've been set up in comparison to some LEPs that have local authorities acting as their accountable bodies, actually in effect at two speeds already and acting as almost an advocate for their particular region. The gentleman just raised the question about HS2. Lord Adonis had mentioned the other night at an event that I attended that after the North Link was announced, you had the Leeds City region and you had Greater Manchester very actively advocating and talking with Whitehall departments around how they could leverage that further. So I guess the question I would have for all of you is there something that's missing around advocating or making sure that LEPs have a separate delivery structure or vehicle of their own, instead of being overly reliant in some cases on local authorities providing the inputs and the intellect in driving them?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And just in passing on the comments about high-speed rail, I agree with the board. First of all, Michael Heseltine has said the only caveat I would put in, and we're not here to debate Crossrail and everything else, but the only caveat I would put in, and it really rather picks up on the point that Dave Skelton made right at the end, is that part of the process of revitalising the regions is not just doing HS2, it is actually getting the communication across a region much, much better, whether that's road or rail or whatever. I speak with feeling as someone from a coastal town. As it happens, Blackpool has good road links on the M55. It's got pretty poor rail links still because of the direct service. But if I can come back to the RGF, come back to the LEP point. I think you're absolutely right. Your analysis is absolutely right. The ability of LEPs to deliver does depend on close and positive symbiotic rather than a parasitic relationship with local government. And I think that the symbiosis works very well in that. And of course, one of the reasons it works very well is that the Greater Manchester area was one of the few areas to resist sort of key withdrawals of sort of public ownership, not least in terms of Manchester Airport in the 1980s, but that passed. The real problem is that the LEPs were set up on the principle of let 1,000 flowers bloom without much of a genetic profile set down from the government. Now, that has meant, in the best cases, that you've had really good front-facing, business-facing entrepreneurs, but they haven't always had the capacity. Those LEPs that do not mirror existing or didn't mirror existing RDA boundaries and that have had both an opportunity and a problem because they haven't had that resource and that capacity. So I think, you know, the reality of the situation is, and this is one of the things that makes me a little nervous about Lord Heseltine's proposal to sort of, you know, push these huge sums of money the way of the LEPs, is that we are going to have a very diverse and a very fractured system of funding and skills responsibility, and we actually have to travel, I think, quite lightly in terms of structures over the next 2 to 3 years and beyond if we are to make sense of both having democratic accountability, which obviously in principle city deals deliver, and business-facing organisation, which LEPs, in theory, may deliver some democratic accountability at the moment, but in practice don't always.
In terms of high-speed rail, I think it's something that needs to happen. I think it's important that we don't think purely of infrastructure building as what links the rest of the country to London and the southeast there, which is why I mentioned earlier on, it's absolutely crucial that we do build up transport infrastructure linking different towns and regions, linking different regions together. I mean, to get from Newcastle to Manchester is a complete nightmare on the train, and it shouldn't be. Just something as basic as that is so important for connectivity and for growth. In terms of having a big advocate, particularly for cities, I'm a big fan of directly elected mayors. And I think if you did have a big figure, a directly elected mayor who could go out and bat for that city, go out and make the case for the city or the region on the global scale, on the national scale, and in the media, that would make such a difference. Compared to at the moment, you have quite a confusing array of spokesmen for cities and for different areas. If you could have a big figure with a democratic mandate behind them, then that for me would make such a difference in terms of having an advocate for a city or a region. Obviously that proposal's been put back a bit, given I think the campaign for direct elected mayors wasn't done very well, and the referendums last year. But I still think in the long term, having a serious figure representing a city or a region is absolutely crucial as an advocate, and absolutely crucial to growth as well.
My point would, on that same issue would be to say that a region, an economic region, needs the right leadership, both from the private sector and also from the public sector, and it has to be regional, it has to be related to the economy itself. So in that context, the examination of combined authorities as part of the landscape, working alongside and with LEPs, is a key and a healthy dynamic to create. Clearly, the advantages of places like Manchester is that they were well down that route in any event in terms of their economic geography and the way they were working together. Many of us experienced a very radical change in terms of the economic geography as it was defined by the government when it generated LEPs, and that's taking time to recover and establish the sorts of right relationships to have the same momentum. But it will come. I remain optimistic, and I think it will make the difference in terms of a regional focus with the right leadership to drive both the public and private engagement in the agenda.
Yes,
Well,
along...
Shall I?
Yes, if you'd like to come in, yes, please.
Yeah, there is an important point to make, but first of all, the point about the mayor and the conurbation authority is absolutely right. We're the only economy that I know in the world which doesn't have a directly elected figurehead running the local economies. But what I don't think has yet gained sort of general currency is that from about 3 months' time, 39 public-private sector partnerships representing the economic engines of this country are going to start work on their own initiatives as to how they get significant sums of money to spend in partnership with their own plans. That's what the bidding process is all about. It starts with funding to provide a basic staff and an additional $250,000 a year in order to employ consultants. When I put that proposal into the report, it was deliberately to ensure the LEPs did not have to use the planning staff of the local authorities. I'm not criticizing the planning staff of the local authorities, but I wanted to give the LEPs the chance to bring an outside dimension of world-class urban planning dimension into the planning process and therefore balance the input that otherwise would have been entirely local authority based. So first they have got a limited resource. Some of them have got much more because they've been given it by the local authorities. Secondly, there is money to employ consultants. Thirdly, there is competition. And fourthly, it starts whenever the Chancellor presses the button, but he is going to press the button as he has said. And I can't think of anything more galvanizing than to change a culture where, as I think you very eloquently explained about the transport edicts that come down, whether you replace this central functional determinism with SWOT analysis based in local hands, bidding for funds to which they've got to add. And I don't think people have really yet realized 39 teams are going to work to achieve that. Now, of course, I hope that the Birmingham and Humberside work that I'm doing can influence the quality of the approach, the breadth of what can be on offer, the dimension of money that could be available. But whatever happens as a result of Birmingham, the fact of that competitive 39 groups of talented local people trying to drive their own economies, I know of no precedent in modern politics for an exercise of that sort.
If we go along the row and maybe collect a couple of questions, do them in pairs, if that's okay. There's a gentleman at the end of the second row in the front who's had his hand up for ages.
Good afternoon, and thank you for all that you've said. I'm a private citizen off the street, come to find out what on earth is going on here. Having read Mr. Baron Lord Heseltine's report, it seemed common sense to me, and I'd hoped to hear that this was something which everybody was going to get behind and use to create conditions for regional growth. I haven't heard too many people dissent from the generalizations, but there's been point scoring. And I just wish, as a taxpayer, that government and people in Parliament could get together and all work together, because this is actually quite important for all of us. I feel that some of the things that are being said are really, they're small things, but important things which people like me never get to hear. And overall, I think that one of the things that the Heseltine report comes down on is skills. And I just wonder how much knowledge there is across the board between civil service and industry as to how the two of them work. Because my brief experience in industry was that the other side didn't know at all, and they just were cash cows. Industry was a cash cow to everybody else. And the money comes out of the air. And I think that some of the things that the governments have been doing recently about procurement, etc., are absolute scandals, and they haven't changed. So is the real answer here that we need skills to be properly put across the board, and we need to work nationally for the national good and stop scoring points off each other? Comment, please.
So we'll collect another one, please.
Wondering if I could ask Lord Heseltine, sorry, Michael Savage from the Times, whether you, first of all, agree with the point about the North, really, and whether under your system we could see more money going to the North. And secondly, it's again about skills. I mean, whether you're a tourist company in London or a high-tech firm in Sunderland, you care about attracting the best people and visitors, and that's about visas. And Vince Cable has recently said he'd like to see a bit of a rethink on visas, a relaxation, so Britain is really open for business, and I wondered if you agreed with that one.
So let's all address this. So I think the essence of the first one is this the kind of thing that we can get cross-party agreement on? It seems sort of like everybody's kind of agreed in terms of the general theme. And can the parties get past the wrinkles in the detail and come up with some sort of joint strategy? And then secondly, what can be done about the north? And I mean, I'd be kind of interested in a view of what do we do in relation to this kind of question if at the end of this competitive process some regions end up doing worse than others, because that's what the result of competition will be. It could be that the Midlands turns out to be brilliant and Sunderland turns out to be not so good. The result of competition is that we have some winners and some losers. So how can a national policy deal with that, the kind of regional problem of some winners and some losers from competition? So if we start off with, can we get cross-party agreement? What do we?
I mean, I think to be fair, certainly in some of the comments that I made, I tried to trace some of the continuities in that. I've said on other occasions, and I've said it again today, that I give great credit to Greg Clark for having sort of kick-started the city deals, and as I say, and the other things. But history, the narrative of previous histories is only important in the sense that it gives us guides or ways to go forward, because obviously we're in a very different world to the world that we were in 2008. And that different world, incidentally, will make it more difficult, I think, to do the sort of big structural, dare I say it, 1970s and 1980s type changes that you were involved with, Lord Heseltine, in the present climate. We'll wait to see what the Chancellor actually says about that when he delivers a response to your report. But can we work together on this? Yes, we can, but I do come back to the point that if you will the ends, you also have to will the means. And if we are agreed on the issue of active, intelligent government helping to shape markets, we really can't have, as in the Northeast has been the case, I mean, a very, very good low-carbon market, renewables, has been shaped over the last 6 years. We've had 2 years of stasis in this area from central government, and that has not helped. So we really do have to now, have a consistent policy of enabling, and those are the sorts of things that we are talking about in opposition, and those are the sorts of things that Ed Miliband talked about in his speech party conference about, revitalising vocational skills education, and which we're sort of debating now. And you'll no doubt hear more from Andrew Adonis on that when he comes to talk to you in a few weeks' time.
Lord Heseltine.
Well, you may be surprised to hear me say this, but I don't think there has been point scoring. I'm immensely gratified at the way in which, across the political spectrum, the report and its ideas have been welcomed and accepted. And indeed, if you can rely on Google, I saw a message on Friday saying that Ed Balls had said they will not tear up the basic ideas in my report, they will build on them. Andrew Adonis is doing exactly the same sort of work in the Northeast as I'm doing in Birmingham and Humberside. And I made the point at the very early stage to consult the TUC, and Frances O'Grady has been fulsome in her comments about the report, to consult Chucker, the official Labour shadow spokesman, Andrew Adonis himself. I talked to Hilary Benn, and I've told everyone I was doing it. From the beginning, I have said I'm not here as a party politician. I'm here because I think we need an industrial strategy, and it needs to embrace the whole spectrum. And I think that it would be generally said, although there are one or two exceptions, but very, very few, there has been a very wide general acceptance of the point of an industrial strategy and doing whatever we can to bolster the outside parts of the UK. So I think that's excellent. There is one thing which I wrestle with, and I think it needs to be said. No one keener than I, or has spent more of my political life trying to help regenerate the cities other than London, although I did actually do a certain amount in the East End of London, but I did it elsewhere as well. The danger we must be careful about is that we see the success of the city of the south of England, of London, and we say we've got to somehow spread that across the country. I think that anything that holds back the south and east of England is prejudicial to the interests of the UK economy. What we have to do is to find policies that actually set free, unleash, encourage, stimulate everybody else. And it may well be that even if we are wildly successful, 10, 15 years' time, the gap still exists. But if they have improved significantly in absolute terms, that may be what we will have achieved. What we don't want is to hold them back by artificial policies which we could change, and we certainly don't want to choke off the success of the southeast. So it's very important, I think, to understand that we're in the business of unleashing the forces that are there and building on strengths that exist. And that, I think, there's a very broad agreement that we should go for it.
I absolutely agree with Lord Heseltine's points. I think the issue for me is, as a region competing with other regions, is not a question of whether the competition takes place. I think it's an absolute inevitability of seeking to grow. I think the issue for me is that the competition, the race, isn't so governed that you are controlled in the car you go in, you're controlled on the road you choose to go on, and your speed limit's set. Because then you're just in a race into mediocrity, not a race to the top. So for me, unleashing that potential is absolutely critical. And I think skills is a very good component, along with the comments that David made earlier about transport and infrastructure. The question for me about skills is not so much that there is a competition around skills, but actually there's a lack of understanding about what skills are required. So, you know, from my point of view, talking to industry in the northeast, both the manner and type of skills it needs are very different, perhaps, from some other regions or some other economies. But the means of getting there need to be different to reflect that. And simply allowing that to happen, enabling that to happen, is the very thing that unlocks the growth potential.
Can I just very, very briefly come back on the point that Michael Savage made? And I think it was the point that you made in your excellent presentation, Dave, about Sunderland, about the need to spread, to get the balance right, because there is an imbalance within regions in skills. There's also an imbalance in terms of the level of skills and the technical level of skills. And, you know, this has been said time and time again, the technical level of skills, the sort of skills that you get via NVQ and NVQ4 is a critical mass in that process. And so when we're talking about regional growth, the devolution of decision-making about skills within an area must be a crucial part of that agenda. And that's why I made the point about it's very, whatever, you know, there's no point arguing about the fact we've got these differential structures. The differential structures are there. The question is, how do we get people to rub along with, in them? Because ultimately, if we don't, and if we're trying to attract external, as we want to, continued investment, we'll be faced with the Kissinger question. The Kissinger, you may remember, at some point in the 60s or 70s, wanted to consult people in Europe on an aspect of American foreign policy and said, who do I ring to ring Europe? Well, the question for the Tata or the Nissan under the new structure will be, who do I ring when I'm trying to decide out of perhaps 5 global positions for major investment, and they are not going to go round, you know, half a dozen local authorities, 8 LEPs, numerous FE colleges, etc., etc. There needs to be, at the end of this process, a structure where there is someone who can pick up the phone and can do business. Because if we don't have that, the investments that we've had in the past, which of course were done under the old RDA system, and Nissan was a good example of that, will not come our way in the future.
Well, as UKCI, of course, is the answer to your question. But can I just deal with one other, because a very important question came up, which you raised, which I didn't deal with in my report, and I wish I had. The competition and losers. Now, these figures are completely irrelevant because I just use them illustratively. There's no fact behind them at all. But if we have 39 LEPs, you can imagine a situation where we'll say 25 of them put in very good reports and everybody's happy. That leaves 14 which are not as good. They could be divided into two categories. First of all, those which could have been good but are incompetent. Well, there's a simple answer to that. Go back and get them to do it again. That leaves, if I've got the figures right, 4 which aren't any good because on the ground, in the locality, there is no sufficient strength to regenerate the economy. And now, under the present system, by and large, people say, well, give them a bit more money, a bit more housing, a bit more roads, a bit more environment, a bit more education. The problem is ignored too easily. So under the system that I'm talking about, I think the problem of the losers is shown up in stark contrast. And I think that is a good thing, because then everybody knows what the problem is, and they can decide whether there's anything to be done about it. And this brings me to the bit of the report I left out completely. There is huge additional capital expenditure in central government in the main programs. You think of ports and airports and motorways and military establishments, the health service, massive annual capital expenditures. And within those programs, there is quite a lot of discretionary locationalism. If you are, for example, going to build a big regional hospital, most of your patients are going to have to travel quite a long way. But it is a massive economic generator, not just per se, but because of all the spin-offs that might come with it. So literally looking at those economies which have not been able to show sustainable growth and saying, what are we doing in the totality, if I think about 250 billion pounds is the figure, something of that sort. Is there anything that could be located which would be transformational? Is an additional concept that could follow? And that is the virtue of saying there is a real problem here and we shouldn't turn our backs on it.
I think we've got time for one more round, so if we've laid it in front and then a gentleman in the middle. Back there.
I'm Susan Spivey from Birchwood Forum, which is a business network located in the Warrington area. And interestingly to hear about local business forums being a useful medium to get both-way connectivity in business terms. In November last year, we organised an event on Atlantic Gateway, and I brought together the chief executives of Liverpool, Manchester and Warrington, and the Warrington one was formerly the RDA chief exec. And it was most interesting to bring them together. And my question now is, it would be very useful for policy exchange, and particularly Lord Heseltine, I would welcome to come to the Northwest in a similar format and to discuss and to hear about all that is going on in the Northwest region. In particular, we have the Atlantic Gateway project, which has impact right across the region. And we also, next year, have the Liverpool International Festival of Business, which is another great opportunity to bring people to the north, to see and to hear, and to exchange business ideas. So I commend a policy exchange event in the Northwest, and we'd welcome you to Birchwood Forum. Thank you.
The clear invitation. I'll leave that on to the policy exchange people, and then the gentleman.
Originally from the northeast, but I read geography at Bristol. Now, much more of the question that was asked by the Times ought to be answered. Are we to bring in skills where they're lacking from overseas, i.e. from Eastern Europe? And the other thing is, what about the Manchester Airports Group taking over a London airport? What is the logic of that?
Two good, very good questions. Who'd like to start?
Will I have a go?
Yeah.
Generation of skills, big issue, and I don't think one should be absolutist in either area. There's clearly going to need to be, in the foreseeable future, some necessity, you know, to have skilled people coming into this country from elsewhere. The question is how you do it, what level, what the numbers are, and all the rest of it. That should not impact on the absolute necessity for us to have a step change in what we do in terms of training and skills and apprenticeships. And that's why issues like linking, I mean, Michael Heseltine's talked about the power of government in terms of locating in areas that are economically flatlining. The power of government in terms of procurement and the leverage that government can have in the procurement in terms of expanding the number of apprenticeships, for example, is absolutely crucial. And the big sort of projects we're talking about, high-speed rail, and that will generate masses and masses of jobs. It's not just the big stuff, it's also the small stuff. I mean, relatively modest developments in local areas, whether it's a new business park, whether it's a new shopping centre, or whatever. And we need to give, at a local level, whether it's to the LEP, whether it's to local government, or some combination thereof, the incentive and the power to say to companies, look, if you want to come and build in our area, you have got to take on apprentices. We've got to have a framework to do that much better. And that's one of the reasons why we're talking about making sure that we encourage and incentivize large businesses to train and skill for their supply chain over and above their own numbers. We need to do that. We need to get that step change. We need to get more apprentices into SMEs in order to stimulate them, and so on and so forth. So you do need to stimulate skills very, very much on the ground, but that can only be done at the margins effectively by central government diktat, or whether you call them targets or whether you call them objectives, which is what John Hayes, the skills minister, said they were. You have to have a step change in terms of the way in which skills policy is delivered and deliberated on locally and sub-regionally.
David, what does the evidence say about immigration? How should we think about immigration and skills?
It's obviously fairly clear that in certain areas we do have a skills shortage, and that's something we need. But for me, the important thing in terms of the long-term future of this country is to get the skills policy right. Let's take the number of skilled engineers, for example. To make up for the number of engineers who are retiring, we have to produce 10,000 more a year, which is why we need to think not just about short-term immigration issues, but I think we really need to think about skills and the education system. Something we've said is absolutely crucial to get employers engaged in design of a decent vocational and technical education at a local level. So you will have employers engage in course design and course assurance with local colleges, with local schools. So there's a clear understanding of what the need is regionally and locally. So you don't just have someone in Whitehall pulling the right levers saying you have to have this many, producing that many qualifications a year. But I think the long-term issue is crucial, that if we are going to grow in the long term in all of the regions we're discussing today, we need to produce the right skills to compete in the global economy. Can I just come back as well to the idea that London and the South East is somehow in competition with the rest of the UK? I don't think that's the case. It's not a choice between a successful London in the South East and a successful North East. We need both. A successful North East needs a successful South East and needs a buoyant city. And the city and the South East should be allowed to expand, make the most of their comparative advantages. But we also need to make the most of the potential of the Midlands and of the North East and of the North West. It's not a choice, it's not an alternative. We absolutely have to make sure that both of them are done.
And so to take a kind of specific example, which is the gentleman's second point, the takeover of a London-based airport by a Manchester company, is that a good thing because it shows that companies based outside of London can own and manage assets in London, or should we be being kind of more structural than that, i.e. saying, no, let's build a bigger capacity outside of London?
I think we have to be careful about being over-structured around these things. I mean, I was just thinking in the context of the North East, and actually one of our main competitors economically for the North East is Scotland. So on immigration policy, I was thinking, well, depending on the outcome of the referendum, it influenced my view about immigration. And I think the same would go about regional airports. In terms of how we compete and how we cooperate to ensure that we maximise the economic advantage in terms of economic activity through the regions is dependent on the circumstances at the time.
I have to say, so I should address this, I have to say as a native Mancunian, I always find it very interesting. I mean, nobody ever says, isn't it terrible, isn't it difficult that a London-based company might be taking over somewhere in the northeast or northwest. So I don't actually see, I mean, it's the calibre of the vision and the investment and the development that matters, I think, not the actual geographical origin of the company concerned.
And why don't we end up with you, Lord Heseltine? Can you remind us of amongst your proposals, there were some in there on skills and immigration, and a targeted immigration policy in particular?
Yes, you've got two aspects of the immigration policy. One is the skills and the universities. There is no constraint on the number of university students that can come here under the present immigration rules. On skills, there is a apparently workable system which enables people to import necessary skills. Should they come? Yes, they should, because we are, in some fields, desperately short of the skills that we need. And there's no conceivable way in which you can train people that quickly to fill these gaps. At the moment, we're holding back. I was in Scotland fairly recently. Someone said, I need 400 engineers, I can't get them. Another one on another table said, I need 100 engineers, I can't get them. I met someone from Newcastle a couple of days later, said, I just turned down an export order because I can't get the engineers to fulfill it. So there's only one place to get them, and that is from overseas. And yes, we should get them. But of course, we should try to deal with the long-term shortage of skills and the long-term underskilling of existing skills. I mean, I think the Prime Minister's made an interesting speech about satisfactory schools which are not delivering excellence. It's the same issue. The standards have to rise, and competition, in my view, of the sort that we're talking about, and local autonomy, can force together the ingredients of people that can bring about those standard improvements the quicker than any other method can be done. On your Liverpool thing, I did a report on Liverpool, which before this, the idea of your festival came out of that report, and I don't think the Northeast can take it, Northwest can take any more of me. I've spent too much time.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. It's been a very interesting session. I think that the third of three of these sessions on industrial policy will be in April, and Lord Adonis will be speaking, so I'm sure everybody's warmly invited to that, and I'd just like to thank the panel.